Welcome to Iris 5 Story, where the line between reality and nightmares blurs. Tonight, we dive into a chilling tale where an old house by the river holds dark secrets that refuse to stay buried. This is Echoes of the Drowned, a story about guilt, revenge, and restless spirits. Prepare yourself to face the mystery of the past that has come back to haunt the present. Can the souls trapped in the water find peace? Or are they doomed to wander forever? Let's begin this eerie journey together. On that night, as cold winds howled through the old house, the river whispered ominously. Quan stood by the window, staring at the dark waters, feeling the cold seeping into the corners of his home. His house wasn't just a shelter. It was a place filled with secrets he had tried to forget for years. But tonight, everything changed. And Zhang, the mysterious girl with haunted eyes, was not who he thought she was. With her arrival, strange things began happening, and the past, long buried, started to resurface. The question is, can Quan escape the darkness of what happened, or will the ghosts of the past catch up to him? The small riverside town of Black Hollow was a place suspended in time, its air thick with the scent of damp earth, and its streets quiet, save for the ever-present whisper of the river that cut through the heart of it. It was a town that didn't forget, where every corner seemed to harbor memories of things long buried. And in the center of it all stood the old house on the hill, the place where Quan lived with his wife, Linda. The house had been in his family for generations, but it had grown weary over time, like a tired old man holding onto memories he couldn't shake off. Quan was a carpenter, a man of few words, yet he was haunted by the shadows of his past. His family's history was drenched in blood. The brutal murders of his parents and grandfather, who had been killed in a violent robbery that happened decades ago, left scars that could never heal. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind that rattled the old shutters, seemed to whisper the names of the dead. His wife, Linda, was his only solace. She was gentle, kind, and warm, a stark contrast to his brooding nature. Yet, even with her presence, something was missing. They couldn't have children, and though they never spoke about it, there was a distance that had grown between them. Linda spent much of her time in the small church in town, praying for a miracle. Quan, on the other hand, buried himself in his work, desperately avoiding the weight of the past. One day, everything changed. Quan was at the market when he saw her, Zhang. She was young, disheveled, with wild eyes that flickered with fear, her clothes torn as if she had been running for days. She told him a story, a tragic tale of how bandits had raided her family's farm and killed her parents. Quan, moved by her plight, couldn't bring himself to turn her away. She reminded him of the helplessness he had once felt as a child, watching his own parents die before him. Against Linda's initial protests, Quan insisted on bringing Zhang into their home. Linda, wary and uncomfortable, reluctantly agreed. The house, already heavy with memories, now felt even more suffocating, as though it was closing in on all of them. That night, as the wind howled outside, Quan stood by the window, staring out at the river. He felt an inexplicable unease, a sense of something watching, something waiting. He shook it off, but the feeling didn't leave. The house seemed to groan under the weight of its history, its walls breathing with a life of their own. Then it happened. As the wind screamed through the trees, Quan heard it. Footsteps. Light, tentative steps, as if someone was walking near the river. He peered out the window, but saw nothing. His pulse quickened. He turned away, but then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. The air grew cold, an unsettling chill that settled deep into his bones. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just his imagination. But the house, the town, the very air itself seemed to carry a weight, like the ghosts of the past were stirring. The shadows grew longer that night, and Quan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. The next morning, as Quan entered the living room, something caught his eye. A family photograph, one of the few left from his youth, lay shattered on the floor. The glass was cracked, and the photo itself had torn. Quan stood frozen, staring at the damage. His mind raced. How could this have happened? He was sure the photo had been fine the night before. But there it was, the remnants of a broken memory, lying in front of him. The picture was of his parents, his grandfather, and himself, taken when they were still a family long before the brutal murders. The photograph had been a rare, fragile link to a time that Kwon would rather forget. But now it was destroyed. He had been in the room just hours before, yet somehow the photo was shattered, as if someone had intentionally broken it. He felt a sudden cold, a shiver that crept down his spine. It was as if the house, or something in it, had rejected the very memory it contained. Jong had walked past the photo earlier in the day, her fingers brushing the frame as she passed through the room. But she hadn't noticed the shift in the atmosphere. She hadn't seen the way the shadows in the room seemed to deepen in that moment. Kwon could feel it. The house was reacting to her presence. He had no way of explaining it, but it was undeniable. The air in the room grew thick, the very walls pressing in on him. His breath felt heavy, like the house was consuming him, drawing him back into the past he had worked so hard to escape. The past that never seemed to leave. Kwon stood there, the shattered photo in his hands, as the house seemed to hum with energy, alive with the unspoken tension between him and the dark secrets that clung to this place. He felt something watching him, watching them all. A cold dread settled in his chest, and for the first time, he began to wonder if bringing Jong into their home was a mistake. That night, Linda didn't sleep well. She tossed and turned, restless, haunted by dreams she couldn't remember. The unease in the house seemed to spread, creeping into every corner. Linda's suspicions of Jong grew as the young woman's behavior became more erratic. She found herself staring at the river for hours, lost in a trance. Her presence in the house felt like a shadow lurking just out of sight, always there, but never truly seen. Kwon, still shaken by the photograph, tried to reassure Linda, but her concerns were growing. She no longer felt safe in her own home, and soon, that feeling of discomfort would not be confined to just Linda. Kwon would begin to feel it too. It was as if the house, the river, and everything in Black Hollow was conspiring against them, pulling them deeper into something they couldn't escape. And as the days passed, Kwon would soon learn that not all the spirits that haunted his past were buried. Some were waiting to be discovered. The sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward the house. The river, usually so quiet, now whispered in ominous tones, like it was holding its breath. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees in a low, almost rhythmic whisper. In the thickening dusk, the house, always old, always heavy with history, seemed to groan under the weight of its secrets. Jong had settled in quietly, too quietly. Her presence in the house was like an unspoken tension, an electric charge that hovered just beneath the surface, threatening to spark. Kwon, though hesitant at first, found solace in her company. She was a silent listener, her eyes dark pools reflecting his sorrow, her own past shrouded in mystery. There was something about her, something in the way she moved, the way she watched him, that unsettled him, even as he tried to convince himself that she was nothing more than a victim of her circumstances. But Linda was different. She didn't trust Jong. From the moment the girls stepped into their home, Linda had been on edge. Her suspicions grew with each passing day, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Jong was hiding something darker than the tragedy she'd claimed to have escaped. Linda's intuition was never wrong, not when it came to people. One evening, after another long day of silence and whispered conversations, Linda's voice broke through the stillness of the house. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she clutched a handful of yellowed newspaper clippings. "You need to listen to me, Kwon." Linda's voice was thin, as if the weight of her words was too much for her to carry alone. Her eyes were wide with fear, her face pale. "Jong is hiding something. I found these." Kwon looked at the papers in her hands, his heart sinking. He had already heard the rumors of a decapitation, of a girl who had been murdered, her body never found. But he dismissed them as just that, rumors, stories told by people who had nothing better to do than spin dark tales. And yet, here was Linda, her hands shaking as she held these clippings, her eyes filled with a fear he hadn't seen in her before. "Linda, you're imagining things," Quan said, but his voice lacked conviction. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off about Zhang, but his attachment to her was growing, inexplicably so. "She's just a victim, like she said. A lost soul." But Linda wasn't convinced. She leaned forward, her voice low and urgent.
"You don't understand.
"I've been reading about a woman who was murdered 20 years ago. Her body was never found, but the details, they match John's story, Quan. It's too perfect, too convenient." A shiver ran down Quan's spine. Something twisted inside him, an unease, a flicker of doubt. But still, he couldn't bring himself to believe Linda. Not yet. Not when his growing feelings for Zhang clouded his judgment. "I don't know what you're talking about, Linda," Quan said, trying to sound firm. "Zhang's just a girl who's been through hell. She's not a killer." Linda stood up suddenly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I know what I'm saying, Quan. You're not seeing it.
She's not what she says she is.
Something about her isn't human." The words hung in the air like a warning, thick with tension. Quan's mind was a battleground now. Part of him wanted to believe Linda, to see the truth in her eyes, but another part of him, the part that had found a strange solace in Zhang's company, couldn't shake the nagging pull he felt toward her. That night, after Linda had gone to bed, Quan found himself alone in the living room, staring at the fire that crackled weakly in the hearth. He couldn't sleep. His mind was too cluttered, too heavy with the weight of Linda's accusations. He glanced toward the stairs, where Zhang's door was closed. Was she really just a lost soul, as she seemed? Or was there something darker lurking behind her calm exterior? The house felt different now. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He heard it, soft footsteps, light and deliberate, pacing in the hallway above. Zhang's door was open, the faintest creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. His heart raced. He tried to dismiss it, but the footsteps seemed to draw closer, closer, until they stopped outside his door. He stood frozen, his pulse pounding in his ears. The air grew colder, and the unmistakable scent of wet earth filled his nose. Something wasn't right. It was as if the house was alive, shifting with an unseen presence. The footsteps faded away, but the sense of dread remained. The following morning, the house was still, too still. Linda had gone to the market, and Quan was left alone with Zhang. She stood by the window, her back turned to him, staring out at the river. "Zhang," he began, his voice low, "I need to ask you something." She didn't turn, but he could feel her awareness of him, like a shadow stretching behind him, just out of reach. "What's your real story?" he asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Zhang's shoulders stiffened. Then, slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes dark and unreadable. "I told you everything," she whispered, her voice calm, but there was something hidden beneath the surface. "But you're not ready to hear it. No one ever is." Her words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Quan felt a chill spread through his chest. He wanted to ask more, but the words caught in his throat. Something in her eyes, something cold, something ancient, stopped him. "Don't trust me, Quan," she said, her voice barely a breath. "The truth is worse than you can imagine." The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing in like they were alive. His breath quickened as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. Was it too late to turn back? As Zhang turned away, disappearing into the shadows of the house, Quan stood frozen. The house felt like it was closing in on him, suffocating him with its secrets. And outside, the river whispered, darker and deeper than before, as if it too were waiting for something, waiting for him to uncover the truth. But as he stood there, trembling with the weight of his own doubts, one thing became painfully clear. Whatever Zhang's secret was, it was something far worse than he could ever have imagined. And now, there was no escaping eye. The days had grown colder, and the town of Black Hollow seemed to hold its breath. The river, usually a tranquil observer of time, now surged with a hidden power, its waters dark and unforgiving. It whispered at night, the sound growing louder as the trees rustled in the ever-present wind, a haunting prelude to the terrible events yet to come. Kwon couldn't sleep. The nights were filled with the distant sound of whispers, of footsteps that never quite reached him, and a cold that settled deep into his bones. Jong's presence had become suffocating, her eerie silence more unsettling than any noise. But it wasn't just Jong. The house had changed. It groaned at night, its walls cracking as if something inside them was waking up, something ancient, something not quite human. Kwon couldn't ignore the feeling that the house had turned against him, and Linda, ever perceptive, grew more restless with each passing day. She could feel the darkness creeping closer, as if the very air around them had thickened. It wasn't just Jong anymore. It was everything. The house, the river, the wind. They all felt like they were conspiring against her, against them. One afternoon, while Linda was by the river, Kwon watched from the porch, his heart heavy with the weight of his thoughts. She had been acting differently lately, more withdrawn, consumed by something he couldn't understand. She would stand by the water for hours, her eyes unfocused, her hands clasped together as if in prayer, but there was no peace in her gaze. Only fear. He should have gone to her. He should have asked if she was all right, if something was troubling her. But for some reason, he couldn't. His mind was elsewhere. On Jong. On the secrets she was hiding, on the way her eyes seemed to watch him too closely, as if she could read every thought he tried to bury. That afternoon, Kwon couldn't shake the nagging thought that something was wrong. Deeply wrong. He had felt it for days now, like a storm brewing on the horizon, the tension in the air growing thicker. But what was it? And why did he feel so powerless to stop it? The scream was the first thing he heard, the unmistakable cry of desperation, raw and sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. It was Linda. Without thinking, Kwon bolted from the porch, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran toward the river, fear flooding his veins as he saw her, a blur of white, struggling in the water, her hands reaching out toward him. "Linda," he shouted, his voice hoarse, but the current was too strong. She was being pulled deeper into the water, her face contorted in terror. The sound of her cries echoed in his ears, each one pulling at his soul, but his legs felt like lead. Every step he took toward her felt like it was taking him further away. He dove into the river, the icy water seizing his breath. He swam toward her, but it was too late. He reached out, his hand brushing hers, but the force of the current swept her away. Her body jerked violently as the river claimed her, and Kwon could only watch in horror, helpless. "No, no, no," he cried, his voice breaking, but it was useless. The river was unforgiving, relentless. It didn't care. Alinda's lifeless body floated away, her eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. Her gaze seemed to pierce through him, accusing him, blaming him for something he didn't understand. But in that moment, Kwon knew. He had failed her. He had failed to protect her, to save her. The days that followed were a blur of grief and guilt. The house, once a place of refuge, now felt like a tomb. Kwon couldn't escape the images of Linda's face, her cold, lifeless eyes haunting him every time he closed his own. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. He wandered the house like a ghost, lost in his own torment, unsure of what was real anymore. Jong, too, had changed. She was always there now, watching him with eyes that seemed to see through him. Her presence felt oppressive, like a shadow hanging over him, always lurking. But it wasn't just Jong. It was the house. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavier with each passing day. One night, as Kwon sat in the living room, staring blankly into the fire, he heard it, the soft sound of footsteps just outside the door. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, but then the footsteps grew louder, closer. He stood up, his heart racing in his chest, and approached the door. "Linda?" His voice trembled, though he wasn't sure why he had said her name. It was impossible. She was gone, swallowed by the river. But still, he called out, his hand shaking as he reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, but there was no one there. Only the cold, empty night. Quan stepped outside, his breath visible in the frigid air, his eyes scanning the darkness. The river whispered to him, the sound growing louder, more insistent. He felt drawn to it, like something was pulling him, urging him to go closer. And then he saw her. Linda. Her figure stood at the edge of the river, her back to him. She was motionless, her long hair flowing in the wind like a ghost shroud. Quan's heart stopped. He took a step toward her, then another, his feet sinking into the wet earth. Linda? His voice was barely a whisper, his throat tight with emotion. She turned slowly, and for a moment, Quan felt his breath catch in his throat. Her eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, stared back at him. But there was something wrong. Something deeply wrong. Her face was twisted in agony, her lips parted in a silent scream. "I didn't mean it," Quan whispered, his voice breaking. I tried to save you, but Linda didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood there, her eyes locked onto his, accusing, cold. And then, in an instant, she was gone, vanished into the mist, as if she had never been there at all. Quan fell to his knees, his body trembling with fear and guilt. The river, silent now, flowed on as if nothing had happened. But the whispers continued, growing louder in his ears, until he couldn't tell where they were coming from. As the night deepened, the house seemed to close in on him once again. Quan could feel it now, something was wrong. It was more than just the loss of Linda. It was something darker, something far more sinister. The house, the river, Zhang. None of it was as it seemed. And as he lay in bed that night, unable to escape the haunting image of Linda's face, he heard it again. The faintest whisper, like a voice in the wind. "You let me die." Quan's heart pounded in his chest. He was no longer sure what was real. He could feel it, something was watching him. Something was waiting. And it wasn't done yet. The house had never felt more suffocating. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards, the sound of a door slowly swinging open, or the wind howling against the windows. It was as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. And in the distance, the river called, its murmur steady and relentless, like the beat of a drum drawing closer to the inevitable. Quan couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched. The house, his family's home, felt like a prison now. A prison where the shadows crept in at night, wrapping themselves around him like chains. His thoughts were clouded, the guilt of Linda's death gnawing at him from within. But it wasn't just the guilt. It was something else, something darker. Something that had been there all along, lurking just beneath the surface. And then there was Zhang. She had become more unpredictable. Her presence in the house, once a strange comfort, now felt like a constant source of unease. There were moments when she seemed almost distant, like her mind was elsewhere. And when she looked at him, those dark, bottomless eyes, Quan felt as though she could see through him, peeling back the layers of his soul. There were whispers now, strange murmurs that seemed to come from her mouth when she wasn't speaking. Words that didn't make sense, foreign, ancient words that made his skin crawl. But it wasn't just Zhang. The house itself was changing. The air had grown thicker, heavier, as though something was pushing back against the weight of its history, urging something terrible to happen. Quan couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. It was as though the house, and the very town of Black Hollow, was alive, breathing, waiting. One night, as Quan sat by the fire, his mind racing with the memories of Linda's death, he found himself staring at the small wooden box that had sat untouched on the shelf for years. It was Linda's diary, the one she had kept all those years. Quan had never dared to open it, too afraid of what he might find, of the truths it might reveal. But tonight, something compelled him to reach for it. His hands trembled as he opened the worn leather cover, the pages yellowed with age. Linda's handwriting was familiar, yet there was a strange heaviness to it now, a weight in every word she had written. As he flipped through the pages, he found her fears, her frustrations with their life together, her sorrow over their inability to have children, her growing suspicion of his distance. But there was something else, something darker. One of the final entries sent a chill through his spine. I fear I am being watched. I hear whispers in the dark, and I feel them, cold and malevolent, lurking just beyond my reach. Quan doesn't see it. He can't. But I know the truth. There is something in this house, something old, something powerful. And I fear it is not just the past that haunts us. The words were clear, but the terror that laced them was palpable. Linda had known. She had known that something wasn't right long before Quan had started feeling it. Something had been watching them, something had been in the house all along. And now, with Linda gone, that presence was more active than ever. Quan felt the weight of the diary in his hands, its pages like a chain wrapped around his heart. He needed answers. He couldn't keep living like this, with the ghosts of the past clawing at his soul. It was time to confront Zhang. He found her in the same place she had been for days, staring out the window, her face pale, her expression blank. The house seemed to hum with energy as he approached her. The shadows stretched longer in the room, as if they, too, were waiting for something to happen. Zhang, Quan said, his voice hoarse with the burden of his thoughts. I need to know. What is happening here? What are you hiding? She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. There was no hint of surprise in her gaze, no fear. Only a strange, unsettling calm. You already know, Quan, she whispered, her voice so soft, so sweet, it sent a shiver down his spine. You've always known. Her words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Quan's breath caught in his throat. He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. No, he said, shaking his head. I don't understand.
What are you talking about? What is happening to me?
To this house. Zhang's lips curled into a smile, but it was not the smile of the girl he had tried to protect. It was cold, twisted, full of secrets he wasn't ready to hear. You have always been part of this, Quan, she said, her voice dropping to a low, almost guttural tone. Your blood is tied to the past that you can never escape. The river remembers, and so do the walls of this house. You cannot hide from what is already inside you. Her eyes glowed, a flicker of something dark behind them, and Quan's heart skipped a beat. He took a step back, his mind reeling. What was she saying? What was she trying to tell him? The house seemed to react to her words, the air growing colder, the walls groaning as if in response. Quan felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. This wasn't just about Zhang anymore. This was something far older, something far darker. And it was coming for him. That night, the house was alive with activity, strange noises, distant whispers, the sound of footsteps pacing in the hallways. Quan could hear them clearly now, as if they were just outside his door. The shadows seemed to move, stretching and shifting as though they had a life of their own. As he lay in bed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They echoed in his ears, wrapping around his mind like tendrils. Quan's pulse raced, his body trembling with fear. He tried to ignore it, to tell himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The house was alive. The house was speaking to him. Suddenly, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, growing louder, approaching his door. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the sound. The door creaked open slowly, the air growing colder with each passing second. Quan's breath hitched in his throat as he saw the figure standing in the doorway. It was Linda. Her body was wet, her hair matted with water, her face pale and lifeless. Her eyes, once full of warmth, were now empty, hollow, and cold. She stood there, staring at him with an unblinking gaze, her mouth opening slowly, as if to speak. I didn't mean it, Quan whispered, his voice hoarse, his hands shaking. But Linda didn't respond. She simply stood there, her gaze fixed on him, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. Quan was left alone in the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. The house felt colder now, more oppressive. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was even worse. It was the silence of something waiting. As the night stretched on, Quan could no longer deny the truth. The house, the river, Zhang. None of it was just coincidence. He had been drawn into something much larger than himself, something that had been waiting for him all along. The past, the guilt, the secrets, it was all coming to a head, and he couldn't escape it. With every passing moment, the house seemed to close in around him, its walls growing tighter, the shadows darker. There was no going back. The truth was waiting for him, and it would stop at nothing to be heard. The house had never felt more suffocating. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards, the sound of a door slowly swinging open, or the wind howling against the windows. It was as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. And in the distance, the river called, its murmur steady and relentless, like the beat of a drum drawing closer to the inevitable. Quan couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched. The house, his family's home, felt like a prison now. A prison where the shadows crept in at night, wrapping themselves around him like chains. His thoughts were clouded, the guilt of Linda's death gnawing at him from within. But it wasn't just the guilt. It was something else, something darker. Something that had been there all along, lurking just beneath the surface. And then there was Zhang. She had become more unpredictable. Her presence in the house, once a strange comfort, now felt like a constant source of unease. There were moments when she seemed almost distant, like her mind was elsewhere. And when she looked at him, those dark, bottomless eyes, Quan felt as though she could see through him, peeling back the layers of his soul. There were whispers now, strange murmurs that seemed to come from her mouth when she wasn't speaking. Words that didn't make sense, foreign, ancient words that made his skin crawl. But it wasn't just Zhang. The house itself was changing. The air had grown thicker, heavier, as though something was pushing back against the weight of its history, urging something terrible to happen. Quan couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. It was as though the house, and the very town of Black Hollow, was alive, breathing, waiting. One night, as Quan sat by the fire, his mind racing with the memories of Linda's death, he found himself staring at the small wooden box that had sat untouched on the shelf for years. It was Linda's diary, the one she had kept all those years. Quan had never dared to open it, too afraid of what he might find, of the truths it might reveal. But tonight, something compelled him to reach for it. His hands trembled as he opened the worn leather cover, the pages yellowed with age. Linda's handwriting was familiar, yet there was a strange heaviness to it now, a weight in every word she had written. As he flipped through the pages, he found her fears, her frustrations with their life together, her sorrow over their inability to have children, her growing suspicion of his distance. But there was something else, something darker. One of the final entries sent a chill through his spine. I fear I am being watched. I hear whispers in the dark, and I feel them, cold and malevolent, lurking just beyond my reach. Quan doesn't see it. He can't. But I know the truth. There is something in this house, something old, something powerful. And I fear it is not just the past that haunts us. The words were clear, but the terror that laced them was palpable. Linda had known. She had known that something wasn't right long before Quan had started feeling it. Something had been watching them, something had been in the house all along. And now, with Linda gone, that presence was more active than ever. Quan felt the weight of the diary in his hands, its pages like a chain wrapped around his heart. He needed answers. He couldn't keep living like this, with the ghosts of the past clawing at his soul. It was time to confront Zhang. He found her in the same place she had been for days, staring out the window, her face pale, her expression blank. The house seemed to hum with energy as he approached her. The shadows stretched longer in the room, as if they, too, were waiting for something to happen. Zhang, Quan said, his voice hoarse with the burden of his thoughts. I need to know, what is happening here? What are you hiding? She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. There was no hint of surprise in her gaze, no fear. Only a strange, unsettling calm. You already know, Quan, she whispered, her voice so soft, so sweet, it sent a shiver down his spine. You've always known. Her words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Kwan's breath caught in his throat. He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I don't understand."
What are you talking about? What is happening to me?
"To this house." Zhang's lips curled into a smile, but it was not the smile of the girl he had tried to protect. It was cold, twisted, full of secrets he wasn't ready to hear. "You have always been part of this, Kwan," she said, her voice dropping to a low, almost guttural tone. "Your blood is tied to the past that you can never escape. The river remembers, and so do the walls of this house. You cannot hide from what is already inside you." Her eyes glowed, a flicker of something dark behind them, and Kwan's heart skipped a beat. He took a step back, his mind reeling. What was she saying? What was she trying to tell him? The house seemed to react to her words, the air growing colder, the walls groaning as if in response. Kwan felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. This wasn't just about Zhang anymore. This was something far older, something far darker, and it was coming for him. That night, the house was alive with activity, strange noises, distant whispers, the sound of footsteps pacing in the hallways. Kwan could hear them clearly now, as if they were just outside his door. The shadows seemed to move, stretching and shifting as though they had a life of their own. As he lay in bed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They echoed in his ears, wrapping around his mind like tendrils. Kwan's pulse raced, his body trembling with fear. He tried to ignore it, to tell himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The house was alive. The house was speaking to him. Suddenly, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, growing louder, approaching his door. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the sound. The door creaked open slowly, the air growing colder with each passing second. Kwan's breath hitched in his throat as he saw the figure standing in the doorway. It was Linda. Her body was wet, her hair matted with water, her face pale and lifeless. Her eyes, once full of warmth, were now empty, hollow, and cold. She stood there, staring at him with an unblinking gaze, her mouth opening slowly, as if to speak. "I didn't mean it," Kwan whispered, his voice hoarse, his hands shaking. But Linda didn't respond. She simply stood there, her gaze fixed on him, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. Kwan was left alone in the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. The house felt colder now, more oppressive. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was even worse. It was the silence of something waiting. As the night stretched on, Kwan could no longer deny the truth. The house, the river, Zhang. None of it was just coincidence. He had been drawn into something much larger than himself, something that had been waiting for him all along. The past, the guilt, the secrets, it was all coming to a head, and he couldn't escape it. With every passing moment, the house seemed to close in around him, its walls growing tighter, the shadows darker. There was no going back. The truth was waiting for him, and it would stop at nothing to be heard. Floorboards beneath Kwan's feet seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, and the air itself felt thick, with an unspoken presence. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was the town, the river, the wind. All of it seemed to conspire, pulling Kwan deeper into its dark embrace. He could no longer distinguish between the haunting whispers in the air and the weight of his own thoughts. Everything felt like it was closing in on him. Days had passed since Linda's death, but the guilt still gnawed at Kwan, clawing at his every waking moment. His heart felt as if it were being crushed by an unseen hand, his chest tight with the weight of his actions, the things he could never undo. But it wasn't just the guilt. There was something else, something far darker. The truth about Zhang, about what she truly was slowly coming to light, but Kwan was too caught in his own torment to face it. And then, one night, everything changed. Zhang had been acting stranger than usual. She had become more distant, almost as if she were slipping further away from the world of the living with each passing day. She spent hours staring at the river, her eyes unfocused, her expression vacant. But tonight was different. Tonight, when Quan found her by the window, she was humming a tune, a low, haunting melody that seemed to resonate deep in his bones. Her voice was soft, but the song, it felt ancient, like a prayer or a curse. When she saw him, her eyes locked onto his with a piercing intensity that sent a chill through his spine. She had never looked at him like that before. "Why are you doing this?" Quan asked, his voice shaking, his mind desperate for answers. "Why can't you just leave? Why won't you let me be?" Zhang stood silently for a moment, her gaze never leaving his. The house seemed to grow even quieter, as if holding its breath. Then, her lips parted, and for the first time since her arrival, Quan heard her speak not in whispers, but in a voice thick with something primal, something old. "You think you can escape the past, Quan?" she said, her words low and cold. "You've always been running from it, but it's already inside you. It has always been inside you." Quan's heart raced, and he felt the room grow colder, the very walls closing in around him. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice desperate, his hands trembling. Zhang turned back to the window, her eyes unfocused again, as though seeing something he couldn't. "It was never Linda you were meant to save," she murmured, almost to herself. "It was never Linda you were meant to love. You were always mine, Quan. Always." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, his mind reeling, unable to comprehend the truth that was slowly unraveling before him. What was she saying? What did she mean? His thoughts were clouded by a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and a deep, unsettling dread. "You're lying," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "You're lying." But deep down, he knew. He knew it wasn't a lie. Zhang turned toward him, her face now more monstrous than human, her eyes dark and hollow, her smile twisted. She had changed. There was no longer any trace of the fragile girl who had once wandered into his life, no trace of the lost soul she had pretended to be. What stood before him now was something darker, something that had been waiting for him, hidden behind the veil of her deceit. "I didn't kill Linda," Zhang said, her voice now sharp, as if the truth were finally slipping through her lips. "But I am the one who caused her death. And I am the one who will make you see the truth of what you are." Quan could barely breathe as the weight of her words hit him.
No.
"No, you're wrong. I didn't do anything." But Zhang's eyes bored into his, unrelenting, accusing. "You did," she hissed. "You did, and you always knew. You are not just a man, Quan. You are a part of something older, something darker. A curse that has followed your family for generations. And now you are mine." Quan's mind spun as he tried to grasp at the words, at the reality that seemed to warp around him. A curse? Something darker? Was this why his family had been torn apart? Why his parents had been slaughtered all those years ago? Was this why Linda had been drawn into this nightmare? Why she had died? Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The pictures in the attic, the stories of his family's violent past, the house that seemed to carry a weight of its own. He wasn't just a man haunted by the ghosts of his past. He was a man born of a curse, bound to a destiny far darker than he could have ever imagined. And Zhang had known. She had always known. Zhang stepped closer to him, her voice growing soft, almost tender. "I am what you were always meant to be with," she whispered. "Not Linda. Not anyone else. You and I, we are one. This bond, this fate, it has always been ours." Quan's mind reeled, unable to process the enormity of what she was saying. He tried to speak, to push her away, but his body felt heavy, sluggish, as if the very air in the room was pressing against him. The house felt alive with energy, dark, malignant energy that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. "I will not be controlled by this," Quan managed to rasp, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I will break free. I will." "No," Zhang interrupted, her voice cold and final. "You can't. You never could. You're already part of it. You always were." The room seemed to darken further, and the whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent, filling his ears with promises of power, of pain, of the truth he had always run from. Quan felt himself falling to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of the realization. He was bound by blood, by a curse, by a fate he could never escape. And the one person who had always been there, the one person he had loved and betrayed, was gone, swept away by forces far beyond his understanding. Zhang knelt before him, her hands cold as they cupped his face. "Now you see," she murmured. "Now you understand." Quan's thoughts were a whirlpool of terror and despair, but as Zhang's hands tightened on his face, something inside him snapped. His mind, his soul, everything within him felt as though it were being consumed by something ancient, something dark. The room was no longer just a room, it was a prison, a tomb, and he was the prisoner. "You're mine now, Quan," Zhang whispered, her lips brushing his ear. "You always were, and you always will be." As her words echoed in his mind, the world around him seemed to dissolve, leaving only darkness, a void. And in that darkness, he could hear it, the river. It was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, a torrent, pulling him into its depths, its cold embrace. But even as the river called to him, Quan realized one terrifying truth. There was no escaping it. There was no escape from her. There was no escape from the bond that had been forged long before his birth. The house was silent again. The whispers had faded. The wind felt more alive than ever. But Quan's mind was alive with the terrible knowledge of what he had become, under the weight of what he was now tied to. The air was thick with an oppressive energy. Zhang stood, the very foundation of the house fading into the shadows, as though it were trying to throw off the dark weight deep inside him, into its bones, like a poison that had seeped into his veins. The wind howled, and the river, always the river, remained eerily still, waiting. Quan couldn't escape the truth. He had tried, desperately, to ignore it, to push it back into the dark corners of his mind where it had always lingered. But now, there was no denying it. Zhang's words, the revelations she had whispered into his ear, they were all too real. He was part of something much older, much darker, than he had ever known. The curse of his family, the blood that tied him to this house, to Black Hollow, it was all true. And Zhang? She was right. He had always been hers. The house, the river, and Zhang. They were all part of a story far older than Quan had ever realized. A story written in blood and sacrifice. And now, he was no longer just a witness. He was a participant. Days passed in a blur. Quan barely slept, consumed by the weight of his new reality. He couldn't escape the house, and he couldn't escape Zhang. The more he tried to distance himself from her, the closer she seemed to draw him in, like a moth to a flame. She never spoke of the past, but her eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, said everything. The bond between them was undeniable, and it was only growing stronger. But then, as if the universe had thrown him a lifeline, someone arrived in Black Hollow. Carter was an ex-detective, a man whose reputation for solving even the most bizarre of cases had earned him a small place in local legend. Quan had heard of him only in passing, whispers of a man who had seen too much, who had delved too deeply into the shadows. But now, Carter was here, drawn to the town by an anonymous tip. A murder, a haunting, the whispers that had long filled the streets. Quan didn't know what to make of Carter. The man's arrival seemed like fate, but it also terrified him. What if Carter uncovered the truth? What if he discovered what Quan had become? What Zhang really was? Quan wasn't sure he was ready to face that yet. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized there was no choice. He couldn't keep living in this nightmare, trapped in a house that was slowly consuming him. He needed answers, and maybe Carter could help him find them. Carter was methodical, patient, and unnervingly sharp. He had a way of asking questions that made you feel like you were being pulled into a web you didn't even know was there. Quan didn't know how much to tell him, how much to reveal. But as the days passed and Carter began to dig deeper, it became clear that the detective was not just interested in the murder that had happened all those years ago. No, Carter was interested in something else. The house, the family, the secrets that lingered like smoke in the air. One evening, as Quan sat alone in the living room, staring at the fire that flickered weakly in the hearth, Carter came to him with a grave expression on his face. He had found something that made his heart race in fear and dread. "There's something about your family, Quan," Carter said, his voice low, steady, but tinged with something darker. "Something I didn't expect. I've been looking into the history of this town, and I found something disturbing." Quan swallowed hard, the weight of Carter's words pressing down on him. "What is it?" Carter hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure they were alone. "Your family. They weren't just victims. They were part of something much bigger. I traced the events of your parents' deaths back to something older than even this town. A series of murders, a pattern of ritualistic killings, all tied to your bloodline." The room seemed to spin, the edges of his vision blurring as the reality of what Carter was saying began to sink in. Quan had always known there was something dark about his family's past, but this was something far beyond what he had ever imagined. Carter continued, his voice cold as he spoke the words that made Quan's stomach turn. "Your family didn't just die in a robbery. They were sacrificed, Quan. And you're the next in line." Quan's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The strange occurrences in the house, the whispers in the night, the way the river seemed to call to him. It wasn't just coincidence. He was part of something ancient, something dark that had been passed down through generations. And now, Zhang was the one who had come to claim him. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Zhang's strange behavior, the way she had manipulated him, the bond they shared, it was all part of the curse, part of the ritual that had been set into motion long before he was born. And now, as the last living descendant of his family, it was his turn to play his part. Carter's words echoed in his ears, the gravity of the situation weighing down on him. The town, the river, the house, they're all tied to this. Your bloodline is cursed, Quan, and the time has come for you to fulfill your role, to complete the ritual. Quan staggered back, his head spinning. This wasn't just a curse, it was a pact. A blood pact that had been sealed long before he was born, and now, he was the one who had to pay the price. There was no escaping it. He had been born into this fate, and there was no way out. I can't, Quan whispered, his voice trembling. "I can't do this." But Carter's eyes were cold, unwavering. "You don't have a choice." As the night fell, the air in the house grew colder, the walls pressing in closer. Quan felt it, the pull of the river, the darkness that was drawing him in, closer and closer. Zhang was waiting for him. He knew she was. Her eyes, those dark, soulless eyes, were always watching him, always pulling him deeper into the nightmare that had become his life. But it wasn't just Zhang now. It was the house. It was the river. It was everything. Quan felt his legs move before he could stop them. He was walking, drawn to the door, drawn to the river. The night outside was thick with fog, the moon barely visible behind a curtain of clouds. The town was silent, as if holding its breath. When he reached the riverbank, Zhang was already there, waiting for him. Her form shimmered in the mist, her eyes glowing with an eerie light.
She didn't need to say anything.
The look in her eyes was enough. Quan knew what had to be done, and as the river roared in the distance, Quan felt the truth wash over him. This was the moment. This was the price of the bloodline. He could feel it, the power, the darkness, the ancient force that had always been there, waiting for him to take his place. There was no turning back. As Quan stepped forward, the river seemed to come alive, swirling and churning as if it knew what was about to happen. The darkness around him closed in tighter, the whispers growing louder, until they filled his mind. There was no escape. The curse had claimed him, and with that, the house, the river, and the town all became silent once again. The air was thick with a heavy stillness as the fog rolled in, swallowing the town in its cold, oppressive grip. Quan stood at the edge of the river, the water below swirling restlessly as if it sensed something coming, something darker than the shadows already cast upon the land. The moonlight filtered through the mist, casting an eerie glow on the water surface, but even that light seemed faint and distant. The world felt unreal, as if everything he had ever known, was slipping away. Behind him, the house loomed like a dark sentinel, its windows empty eyes that watched him, waiting for him to make his choice. But there was no choice, not anymore. The curse, the bloodline, John. Everything had led him here, to this moment. And there was no escaping it. The weight of his fate pressed down on him like a stone, suffocating him. As he turned away from the river, his heart pounded in his chest. He could feel her presence.
John.
She was near. He didn't have to see her to know she was there. Her shadow hung over him like a storm, and the very air around him seemed to tremble with her power. He had come to the river to face whatever this darkness was, to confront the truth of his bloodline. But now, standing on the precipice, he realized something far worse than he could have ever imagined was about to unfold. The house was silent as he stepped inside, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. He had always known the house was alive, but tonight it felt different. The walls were no longer just walls. They seemed to breathe, to pulse with an energy that was both familiar and foreign. It was as if the house itself was watching him, waiting for him to acknowledge its truth. He moved through the darkened hallway, each step drawing him closer to the one place he had tried to avoid: the mirror. The mirror in the hallway had always unsettled him. It was old, framed in tarnished gold, its glass cracked in places, but it had always been there. When Quan was a child, he had been terrified of it. There was something in its reflection that seemed off, something that didn't belong. His parents had always dismissed his fears, but he had never been able to shake the feeling that the mirror held something dark, something alive. As he approached the mirror, his breath caught in his throat. The reflection staring back at him was not his own. It was distorted, twisted. His face seemed to ripple in the glass, warping like a figure seen through water. And then, slowly, the reflection began to change. At first, it was subtle, a shadow in the corner of the glass. But then, the figure in the reflection grew clearer, more defined, until it was unmistakable. It was Linda. Her waterlogged face stared back at him, her hollow eyes wide with terror, her lips twisted in a silent scream. She was not just a reflection. She was there, alive in the mirror, trapped in it, her figure flickering like a fading flame. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped, as though everything had paused in a moment of suffocating dread. "You didn't save me," Linda's voice echoed from the mirror, her words barely a whisper, yet they seemed to fill the entire house. "You let me drown." Quan recoiled, his heart racing in his chest as he backed away from the mirror, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The reflection of Linda faded, but the chill of her presence lingered in the room, wrapping around him like ice. "Do you see now?" John's voice was like a serpent's hiss, low and sinister, coming from the darkness behind him. Quan turned quickly, his eyes locking onto her. She was standing in the doorway, her figure bathed in the faint glow of the moonlight that filtered through the windows. Her eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light, and for a moment, Quan could see it clearly. The darkness, the power that radiated from her. It was not just Zhang anymore. She was something else, something far more dangerous, far more ancient than he had ever realized. "This is your reflection now," Zhang continued, her voice smooth and deadly. "This is who you've become. The curse, the bloodline, the ritual. It's all a part of you, Quan. It always was." Quan's stomach twisted in horror as the full weight of her words hit him. He had known, deep down, that he was tied to something terrible, something dark. But seeing it reflected in the mirror, seeing Linda's ghostly image staring back at him, was too much. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "You don't understand," Quan whispered, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't." "No," Zhang interrupted, stepping closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You did. You always did. This was your destiny. It was always going to end like this." She moved toward him with a predatory grace, her footsteps silent on the cold wooden floor. You were never meant to escape it, Quan. You were always mine. The room grew colder, the shadows deepening as Zhang stepped into the light, her figure casting long, twisted shapes across the floor. Quan felt the pull of her, the magnetism of her presence drawing him in, closer and closer, until he could feel her breath on his skin. Her voice, soft and inviting, whispered into his ear, sending shivers down his spine. You were born for this, she murmured. For me. For the ritual. You're not just a man, Quan. You are part of this house, this bloodline, this curse. And now you'll complete it. As Zhang's words sank in, Quan's heart raced. The truth, the curse, it was all too much to bear. But one thing was clear. There was no way out. He had come this far, and now, it was time to face what he had been running from all along. His hand reached out, trembling, as if his body was no longer his own, as if the house, the river, and Zhang were all pulling him in, consuming him. He looked into the mirror again. This time, it was no longer Linda's face that stared back at him, but his own, twisted, dark, and consumed with the same power that had always been inside him. The bloodline, the curse, the ritual, it was all part of him. He had become what he had feared, and there was no turning back. Zhang stepped forward, her cold hands gripping his arms, and for the first time, Quan felt the full weight of his destiny settle on him. The mirror seemed to shimmer, its reflection now a gateway, a doorway into something darker. You belong to me now, Zhang whispered, her voice sweet like honey, but her eyes cold and filled with ancient power. And as the darkness closed in around him, Quan understood. The mirror was not just a reflection. It was the doorway to his fate. And now, there was no escape. The house was alive with the pulse of something ancient, something dark. The walls seemed to hum with energy, the air thick and suffocating. Quan could feel it in his chest, the weight of the curse, the pressure of the bloodline, pulling him down into something far darker than he had ever imagined. The mirror had shown him his reflection, but now, the true horror was unfolding before him. Zhang's presence loomed over him like a shadow, and the house felt like it was closing in, pressing against him, urging him to fulfill the role he had always been destined for. The moon hung high in the sky, its light filtering through the mist outside, casting long shadows on the floor. The air was cold, unnaturally so, as if the earth itself had frozen in place. Quan stood in the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the altar that had always been there, hidden away in the deepest corner of the house. It had always been an object of his nightmares, a place he had never dared to approach, a place that had always felt wrong. But now there was no avoiding it. The altar was calling to him, and he could feel its pull, like the river that had always beckoned him. His hand trembled as he reached for it, the cold stone beneath his fingertips sending a jolt of fear through him. Zhang stood behind him, her presence a weight on his back, her eyes never leaving him. It's time, Quan, she whispered, her voice like silk, but her words laced with an undeniable edge. The ritual must be completed. Your blood, your soul, they belong to me now, to us. Quan swallowed hard, his throat dry. His body moved on its own, as if the house, the ritual, had taken control of him. He could feel the power building around him, swirling in the air like a storm, ready to consume him. The altar was bare, save for a single black candle, its flame flickering in the dark. Quan's heart pounded in his chest as he stood before it, his mind racing. There was no turning back. The ritual had begun long before this moment. The bloodline, the curse, it had all been leading him here, to this point, where there was no escape. Zhang stepped forward, her eyes glowing with a strange, unsettling light. She moved with an eerie grace, her fingers brushing the edge of the altar as she placed the candle in front of him. The bloodline must be completed, Quan. The pact must be sealed. Quan's breath caught in his throat as he looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always known, deep down, that he was bound to this moment. The bloodline, the curse, the ritual, it was all part of him. But now, standing before the altar, He realized that the truth was far worse than he had ever feared. "You are mine," Zhang continued, her voice low and seductive. "And once the ritual is complete, you will be bound to me forever. Your soul will be ours to command." The darkness in the room seemed to intensify, the shadows creeping closer, wrapping themselves around Quan's body. He could feel the pull of the ritual, the weight of it settling over him like a shroud. It was too late to turn back. He could feel the presence of the house, the town, the river. It was all part of this moment, part of the pact that had been made long ago. Zhang moved closer, her hands cold as they pressed against his chest. "You are mine now," she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. "And together, we will complete the curse." The ritual was simple in its own way, yet it was the most terrifying thing Quan had ever experienced. Zhang held a small, jagged knife in her hand, its blade glinting in the dim light. She held it up, her eyes locked onto his as she moved it closer to his skin. "You must give your blood, Quan," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "It is the only way. It must be spilled, and the pact will be sealed. Only then will we have the power we seek." Quan's heart raced as he stared at the knife. His skin felt like it was burning, as if the blood inside him was fighting against the pull of the ritual. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to give in. But deep down, he knew he had no choice. The curse had already taken hold of him, and there was no escaping it. With trembling hands, he reached for the knife, his fingers cold as they gripped the handle. The blade was sharp, the point pressing against his palm as he held it up. The room seemed to hold its breath as he lifted it toward his chest. "You are mine," Zhang repeated, her voice almost a chant now, a rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. "Give me your blood, Quan. Give me everything." The blade slid across the skin with ease, the sharp edge cutting into him, and Quan felt the warm blood begin to trickle down his chest. It was a strange sensation, the blood leaving his body, the power of the ritual intensifying with every drop. The shadows in the room seemed to dance, their forms twisting and shifting as if they were alive. The flame of the candle flickered wildly, casting strange, distorted shapes on the walls. And through it all, Quan felt the pull of something greater than himself, something ancient, something far beyond his control. Zhang's eyes shone with a dark light as she watched the blood flow from his body, her lips curling into a smile. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with satisfaction. "Now you understand. Now you see what you are. You are the vessel. You are the sacrifice." The room grew darker, the shadows swallowing the light as the power of the ritual reached its peak. Quan felt as though the house, the town, the entire world was closing in around him, consuming him. His mind spun, the edges of reality blurring as he struggled to hold onto himself. He could feel the blood leaving him, the life draining from his body, and yet he couldn't stop it. The ritual had taken control of him, and there was nothing he could do to break free. Zhang stepped closer, her hands cold as they pressed against his chest, her fingers wrapping around his heart. "The pact is complete," she said softly, her voice almost a purr. "You are mine, Quan, and together, we will rule over the darkness." Suddenly, everything shifted. The air in the room grew cold, a biting chill that sank deep into his bones. The shadows around him seemed to surge forward, coiling around him like serpents, binding him to the altar. And then, in the reflection of the candle's flame, he saw it, his own face, twisted, dark, and unrecognizable. The ritual had been completed. The bloodline had been sealed. Quan was no longer just a man. He was part of something much older, something far darker. And there was no escape. Zhang stood before him, her eyes gleaming with dark triumph. "You are mine, Quan, forever." And as the darkness closed in around him, as the shadows swallowed the last remnants of his soul, Quan understood. The curse had claimed him, body and soul. There was no turning back. And now, with the ritual complete, the power of the bloodline would rule them all. The house was a tomb, a hollow shell of what it once was, now consumed by the darkness that had long haunted it. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, the once familiar warmth of home now replaced by an unrelenting cold. The shadows that clung to the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, stretching and shifting as if they were waiting for something, waiting for him. Quan stood in the center of the room, his eyes vacant, his mind still struggling to process what had happened. The ritual was complete. The blood had been spilled. He was no longer just a man. He had become something else, a vessel for something far older, far darker. His soul was now bound to the house, to the curse, and to Zhang. Zhang, standing just behind him, was a figure of unnatural beauty. Her eyes glowed with a dark light, her smile twisted with triumph. She had won. She had claimed him, and now she would reign over him, over the house, over everything. "You are mine, Quan," Zhang whispered, her voice soft and seductive, yet carrying an undeniable authority. "And now, you will see the world through my eyes." Quan felt a shudder run through him, not from fear, but from the power that had taken root inside him. It was as though the very essence of the house had merged with him, as though every brick, every beam, every shadow now pulsed in time with his own heart. The power of the bloodline, the curse, was inside him, coursing through his veins. And there was no escape. But even as Zhang's dark influence filled him, something inside Quan fought back. It was faint, like a dying ember struggling against the growing storm, but it was there. His memories of Linda, the love they had shared, the life they had once tried to build. It all came rushing back to him. He remembered the feeling of her hand in his, the warmth of her smile, the sound of her voice before she had been taken from him. Alinda's face flashed before his eyes, a vision of her standing by the river, her eyes accusing him, blaming him for everything. He had failed her. He had allowed her to die. "No," he whispered to himself, his voice hoarse. "I can't let this happen. I can't let her die, for nothing." But as soon as the words left his lips, the weight of the curse pressed down on him again, suffocating him, silencing the small voice of resistance within. The power of the ritual, the power of the bloodline, was too much. It consumed him. It consumed his thoughts, his desires, his very soul. Zhang's laughter echoed in the room, a dark and victorious sound that filled every corner of the house. "You cannot fight what is inside you, Quan," she said, her voice like velvet and steel. "You are mine, and together we will rule." But even as her words filled him with dread, another part of him, a part he had thought long dead, began to stir. It was a flicker of defiance, a spark of the man he used to be, the man who had loved Linda, the man who had been betrayed by the darkness. And with that spark came a terrifying realization. Zhang had made a mistake. She had underestimated him. Quan's hand, which had been limp at his side, clenched into a fist. The power of the curse that had taken root in his chest pulsed violently, but he fought against it, struggling to push through the suffocating grip of darkness. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body shaking with the effort. "I'm not yours," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I am my own, and I will fight for what is left of me." Zhang's eyes narrowed as she watched him, her smile faltering for the first time. She took a step toward him, her presence a tidal wave of power, but this time, Quan didn't flinch. He stood tall, his chest heaving with defiance. "You cannot escape the curse," Zhang said, her voice laced with venom. "You are bound to me, bound to this house, bound to the bloodline. You cannot break free." But Quan wasn't listening. He had heard her words before, and he had believed them. But now, in this moment, with the weight of everything he had suffered, everything he had lost, he realized one thing. He wasn't bound to her. He wasn't bound to the curse. He was bound to his own choices. With a sudden, raw surge of strength, Quan reached out, his hand grabbing hold of the candle on the altar. The flame flickered wildly, but it didn't go out. Instead, it grew brighter, its light cutting through the suffocating darkness in the room. The shadows recoiled, as though the very essence of the house was retreating from the light. Zhang's eyes widened, and for the first time, she took a step back. "No," she hissed. This is not possible. You cannot break the bond. You are mine. But Quan wasn't listening anymore. The candle's flame burned hotter, brighter, and in that moment, he realized that the light, the warmth, was more than just a symbol. It was a weapon against the darkness, against her. "Leave me," Quan growled, his voice full of the fury and pain that had been building inside him. "Leave this house." He raised the candle high above his head, the flame now a blinding light that filled the room, pushing the shadows back. Zhang recoiled, her hands raised to shield herself from the light, but it was too late. The house seemed to shake as the darkness was driven out, as if it were alive and screaming in pain. The walls groaned, the floor cracked beneath them, and the very foundation of the house seemed to shudder with the force of the light. Zhang's face twisted in agony, her eyes wide with fear.
No.
"You can't." But before she could finish her words, the light from the candles surged outward, engulfing her. The room was filled with blinding brightness, and Quan closed his eyes, feeling the last remnants of the curse burn away, the weight of the darkness lifting from his shoulders. When the light faded and Quan opened his eyes, he found himself standing alone in the room, the candles still glowing softly in his hand. The shadows had retreated, and the house, once alive with darkness, was now still, silent. Zhang was gone. The weight that had burdened him for so long was finally lifted. He was free. But as Quan looked around, he realized that the battle wasn't over. The house, the river, and the town had all been part of the curse. But now, as he stood in the midst of it all, he knew that he had broken the chain. He had defeated the darkness that had ruled over him. Yet, the price of victory had been high. Linda's face lingered in his mind, and the guilt he felt for her death would never truly leave him. But he knew that the only way to honor her memory was to live, to move forward, free from the curse that had consumed him for so long. The house was still standing, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a place where he could begin again. As Quan stepped out into the cold night, the moonlight bathed the land in a soft glow. The town was silent, the river flowing steadily beside him. The darkness was gone, but the scars remained. The curse had been broken, but the past would always linger, a shadow at the edge of his mind. But for the first time in years, Quan felt a sense of peace. He had faced the darkness, and he had survived. And now he was free. Breath, waiting for something to happen. But for Quan, nothing would ever be the same again. As he stood outside the house, his eyes scanning the town of Black Hollow, he felt the eerie stillness settle into his bones. The streets were empty, the houses dark, as though the life had drained from the town. The curse, the bloodline, Zhang, they had all been part of this place. And now, with the curse broken, it felt as if the town itself was waiting for the next chapter to begin. The house behind him loomed like a dark silhouette in the night, its windows like empty eyes staring into the void. It had been the source of so much pain, so much torment. But now, it stood still and silent, as if it had been abandoned. The darkness was gone, but it was still there, lingering in the air, in the ground, in the very bones of Black Hollow. Quan's heart ached as he thought of Linda, of the life they could have had, the future they had been denied. She had been taken from him by forces beyond his control, by a curse he had been born into. But in the end, it was his choices that had determined his fate. And in breaking the curse, he had also broken the chain that had bound him to the past. As Quan began to walk down the path that led out of the town, he felt the familiar pull of the river. It was quiet now, its waters flowing calmly beneath the moonlight, but there was something haunting about it. The river had been the scene of so much suffering, so much loss, and yet, now, it seemed peaceful, as if the darkness that had once lurked there had been washed away. But Quan knew better. The past didn't just disappear. It lingered, waiting to be remembered. And as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. something that had been part of him, part of the curse, and now, part of his redemption. He stopped by the river's edge, staring into the flowing water, the cool breeze brushing against his skin. The silence was deafening. The wind rustled the trees, but there was no sound of footsteps, no sign of life. And then he saw it, a shadow, standing by the water. He knew who it was before he even looked. Linda. Her figure was hazy, flickering in the moonlight like a reflection in the water. But she wasn't the same as before. She wasn't the accusatory figure she had been during the ritual. Now, she looked different, calm, serene, at peace. Quan stepped closer, his heart heavy in his chest. "Linda," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I never wanted this. I never wanted you to be part of this darkness." The figure of Linda didn't speak, but the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She had forgiven him. The anger, the pain, the grief, they were all gone now. In this moment, there was only peace. He reached out toward her, but as he did, the figure of Linda began to fade, dissolving into the mist that rose from the river. For a brief moment, Quan thought he saw her smile, a quiet, loving smile that said everything. And then, just like that, she was gone. A deep silence fell over the river, and Quan stood there, staring at the spot where Linda had been. He didn't know what to feel. Sadness, relief, guilt. Maybe all of them at once. But there was something else, something deep within him that told him it was time to let go. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Quan turned away from the river and started to walk back toward the town. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The scars of the past would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface. But for the first time, he felt like he could move forward. The curse had been broken, the darkness had been vanquished, and John was gone. But the journey of redemption wasn't over. Quan still had a long way to go to make amends, to rebuild what had been broken, to find peace in a world that had been torn apart by his actions. As he walked through the empty streets of Black Hollow, he felt the weight of the past finally starting to lift. The town, too, felt different now, lighter, somehow, as though the curse had been broken for good. The house behind him, once a symbol of fear and torment, now felt like a relic of a time long past. Quan didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the man he had been. The darkness that had defined him for so long was gone. And while the past would always be a part of him, it no longer controlled him. As he walked toward the edge of the town, where the forest met the open road, Quan felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was his road to walk. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running from something. He felt like he was finally moving toward something. And that in itself was enough. As Quan left Black Hollow behind, the sun began to rise, casting its first light on the world. It was a new day, a new beginning. The past was behind him, and the future stretched out before him, full of possibility. The curse was broken. The darkness had been defeated. And now Quan was free. The wind howled through the trees as Quan made his way down the dusty road, leaving the memories of Black Hollow behind. The weight of the curse, the darkness, and the pain that had once consumed him now felt like distant echoes, fading with every step. Yet, even as the road ahead stretched out before him, there was a gnawing feeling in his chest, a sensation that something wasn't over. He couldn't shake the feeling that the past had not finished with him yet. The town of Black Hollow, once a place of horror and torment, seemed to be receding behind him, hidden in the fog of his memories. But no matter how far he went, no matter how many miles he put between himself and the cursed house, he couldn't escape the truth that had haunted him for so long. The curse had not been fully broken. Something, or someone, was waiting for him to face it all over again. The darkness that had lived in his bloodline was not something that could be erased with a single act of defiance. It was a part of him, woven into his very being. And though he had defeated Zhang, broken the ritual, and cast away the shadows, there was a deep, gnawing feeling that something else was coming, something even worse than before. He hadn't seen the last of the ghosts. Not yet. As he continued his journey down the road, the atmosphere grew heavy once more, like the air before a storm. The wind carried whispers, faint but persistent, that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that it was just the wind or his mind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew better. The past was calling him back. It had never truly left. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting the silence. It was a message from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. The message was short, simple, and terrifying. The words felt like a punch to his gut. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the screen, trying to process what he had just read. There was no signature, no name, just the ominous message that seemed to come from nowhere. But Kwon knew. He knew it wasn't a coincidence. He wasn't alone anymore. The past had found him again. The road ahead was winding and treacherous, cutting through a dense forest that felt as though it had grown wilder with each passing mile. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the trees whispered in the wind, their branches swaying like twisted fingers. The town was far behind now, but the sense of unease clung to him, suffocating him. Kwon's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a picture, a grainy, dark image of a woman standing at the edge of a river, her face obscured by shadows. Kwon's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the figure immediately. It was Linda, or rather, it was the ghost of Linda, the one who had haunted him, the one who had never truly left. But the message that accompanied the photo was even more chilling. The words struck like a lightning bolt. The guilt, the pain, the loss, it all came rushing back. But now, something had changed. The past wasn't just haunting him anymore. It was hunting him. With no clear destination, Kwon found himself drawn back toward Black Hollow. It was as though the town itself were calling him, pulling him back to the place where it had all begun. The phone messages, the haunting image of Linda's ghost. He couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. He didn't know what to expect. But he knew one thing: whatever waited for him in Black Hollow wasn't finished yet. Jong's death hadn't been the end. It had merely been the beginning of something far darker, something far more twisted than he had ever imagined. By the time he reached the outskirts of the town, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. The streets were eerily quiet, as though the town itself had been abandoned. The houses, once full of life, now stood like hollow shells, empty and decaying. But when he reached the house, the cursed house, his heart froze. It was alive again. The windows were glowing with a strange, unnatural light. The door, once shut and abandoned, stood ajar, as though it were waiting for him to enter. And from inside, Kwon could hear it, the whispers, the same whispers that had tormented him for so long. The darkness hadn't gone anywhere. It had merely been hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike. As Kwon stepped into the house, the air seemed to grow thicker, colder. The walls groaned under the weight of something ancient, something sinister. The light in the windows flickered and dimmed, and the temperature dropped, as if the house itself had come alive with an unnatural energy. He walked slowly through the darkened halls, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper in the air, seemed to push him deeper into the heart of the house. The air was thick with the scent of decay, but it wasn't just the house that felt dead. It was the town itself. It was as if Black Hollow had been consumed by the very curse that had once haunted him. And then he saw it. The mirror. It stood in the same place it had always been, but this time, it wasn't just a reflection. This time, it was a doorway. The image in the mirror shifted, and Kwon's breath caught in his throat. It was Linda again, but this time, she was not a ghost. She was alive, alive in the reflection, her eyes wide with fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. "No," Kwon whispered, his voice shaking with the weight of what he saw. "It can't be." But it was. And in the reflection, he saw another figure standing behind Linda, someone he hadn't expected, someone who had been waiting in the shadows all along. It was Jong. Her eyes gleamed with dark power as she stepped forward in the mirror, her smile twisted and cruel. "You thought it was over," she purred, her voice echoing through the room. "But the past is never finished. And neither are you." The darkness in the mirror surged, pulling Linda and Quan into it. The house seemed to vibrate with the force of the curse, and the whispers grew louder, filling his mind with visions of pain and torment. The house was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing nightmare, a place where the past and the present collided, where the darkness never truly left. And as Quan stood frozen in the mirror's grip, he realized that he had never really escaped it. The curse was not just a part of him, it was his destiny, and it would never let him go. The house was alive again. Quan stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes locked onto the mirror as Zhang's cold, malevolent smile burned into his mind. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air thick with the presence of something ancient and powerful. Linda's face stared back at him, trapped in the reflection, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth forming silent words he couldn't hear. Zhang's figure stood behind her, a twisted, spectral silhouette. Her eyes glimmered with an unearthly light as she moved closer to the reflection, as though the glass could no longer contain her. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, spreading outward, consuming the very essence of the house. "No," Quan whispered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "This can't be happening. It's not real." But it was real. Every step he took toward the mirror seemed to pull him deeper into its web, as though the darkness itself was feeding on his fear. He reached out a trembling hand, but the mirror's surface rippled, distorting his reflection, twisting it into something grotesque. His own face was no longer his own. It was a mask of darkness, corrupted by the very curse he had tried to escape. Zhang's voice echoed in his ears, soft and venomous. "You can never escape, Quan. This is your fate. This is your destiny." His heart pounded in his chest as his reflection shifted again. Linda's ghostly form seemed to fade, but then she reappeared, her face even more distorted than before. She was not the woman he had loved. She was a hollow, broken version of herself, a reflection of the torment he had put her through. And behind her, Zhang's shadow grew, stretching across the room like a dark, oppressive cloud. "Linda," Quan gasped, his voice trembling with guilt. "I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted you to be part of this." But Linda didn't respond. She couldn't. The curse had trapped her, just as it had trapped him. She was a ghost, a prisoner in the reflection, and her eyes were filled with an accusation he could never escape. A sudden, sharp pain pierced his chest, and he stumbled back, clutching at his heart. The house seemed to groan around him, the walls pressing in as if they were alive, suffocating him. The curse, the darkness that had been passed down through his bloodline, was drawing him in. He could feel its grip tightening, pulling him toward the mirror. As Quan stumbled backward, he heard a voice, faint at first, but growing louder. It was a voice he knew all too well, the voice of his father, the voice from the past. "You've always been part of it, Quan. The darkness runs through your veins. You were born for this." Quan's breath hitched as the words echoed in his mind, and he remembered the stories his parents had told him, the secrets they had hidden. The curse was not just something that had happened to him. It was something that had been passed down through generations, something his family had embraced, something they had welcomed. His father's face, twisted with anger and fear, appeared in the mirror alongside Linda's. "You are part of the bloodline, Quan, and the bloodline demands its price." The truth hit him like a tidal wave. He had never fully understood the legacy of his family, the darkness that ran through their veins. The curse was not an accident. It was a pact, a deal made long before his birth, a deal his ancestors had made with something far darker than he had ever imagined. Zhang's laughter echoed through the house, and Quan's legs weakened beneath him. He fell to his knees, unable to tear his eyes away from the mirror. The figures inside it, the ghosts of his family, the darkness that had claimed them, stared back at him, unblinking, unmoving. They were all trapped in the reflection, caught in the cycle of the curse, and now he was part of it. The bloodline. The sacrifice. Zhang stepped forward, her cold hand reaching out to touch his shoulder. He flinched, but there was no escape. She whispered into his ear, her voice like silk and poison. The curse is yours to bear, Quan. You cannot break free from what you are. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with terror and rage.
What are you? He demanded. Why?
Why me? Zhang's smile widened, her eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. You were born for this. You are the chosen one, Quan. The one who will complete the ritual. The one who will end the bloodline. Or begin it anew. Zhang's words began to sink in, and the weight of what she was saying nearly crushed him. He had been blind. He had thought he could escape. But the truth was inescapable. He had always been part of this cursed bloodline. The ritual, the curse, the darkness. It was not something that had happened to him. It was something he had inherited. And now, he was bound to it, tied to it in a way he could never escape. The mirror shimmered once more, and this time, the reflection changed. Linda's face twisted into a mask of sorrow, but as she reached out, it wasn't just her spirit he saw. The reflection of Quan, distorted and darkened by the curse, was reaching for her, as though he, too, were trapped in the mirror, forever bound by the darkness. No, Quan shouted, reaching out to the reflection. I won't be part of this anymore. But as his fingers brushed against the mirror, a searing pain shot through his body. He pulled his hand back, falling to the ground as the vision in the mirror seemed to come alive. The walls around him groaned, the house seeming to shift and change, as though it were responding to the curse's final demand. Zhang's voice echoed in the room, her words a cold, taunting promise. You have a choice, Quan. You can complete the ritual, end the bloodline, and release us all. Or you can join us in the mirror, forever trapped in the darkness. The room seemed to spin as the mirror's reflection swirled, the light from the candle flickering wildly, casting strange shadows on the walls. Quan's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come so far, fought so hard, but now, in the face of the truth, he realized that the choice before him wasn't simple. It wasn't just about breaking the curse. It was about ending it or embracing it. He reached for the mirror once more, his hand trembling. The reflection of Linda, the face of his father, Zhang's haunting smile, they all stared back at him, waiting for him to make his choice. And then, in that moment of clarity, Quan understood. The curse was not just something to be defeated. It was something to be broken, something to be ended by him. He had the power to break it, to free the souls trapped in the mirror, to end the bloodline once and for all. With a final, desperate cry, Quan thrust his hand into the mirror, his body filled with a sudden, fierce strength. The room exploded in light, the mirror shattering into 1,000 pieces as the house shook violently, the darkness screaming in fury. Quan fell to the floor, his body trembling, but he knew the curse was finally over. The mirror, the house, the bloodline, it was all gone. And Quan was free. Quan's body felt heavy as he stumbled away from the shattered mirror, the pieces scattered across the floor like broken memories. The house was shaking, the very walls groaning under the weight of the curse finally being broken. The darkness that had once loomed so large now seemed to retreat, its hold on him, on the house, starting to loosen. The room was still. The house had gone quiet, as if holding its breath. The echoes of Zhang's laugh, the whispers of the past, the pressure of the curse, they had all vanished. But in their place was a deep, unsettling silence. A silence that made Quan feel like he was standing at the edge of something new, something terrifying. Zhang was gone. The mirror, the reflection, the twisted ghosts of his family, they had all been shattered with the glass. But even as the house stood silent, even as the shadows seemed to retreat, Quan couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. Something unfinished. The past had never truly left. It lingered, a constant presence at the back of his mind, like a shadow that refused to fade. Suddenly, a soft voice echoed through the silence. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. But as Quan stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice grew clearer. Quan. He spun around, his eyes searching the room. The air grew cold again, the familiar, suffocating chill creeping into the corners of the house. And then, in the doorway, he saw her. Alinda. She stood there, her form flickering in the dim light, her face pale and ghostly, her eyes hollow with sorrow. But this time, there was no anger, no accusation in her gaze. Instead, there was something else. Something that Quan couldn't quite understand. She wasn't the same as before. She wasn't just a ghost haunting him. She was waiting for him. Alinda's voice broke the silence again. You did it. You freed us. But you're not free yet. Quan's breath caught in his throat. The weight of her words sank deep into his soul. He had broken the curse. He had ended the darkness. He had freed Linda from her torment. But now, in this moment, it felt as though something even darker was still waiting for him. Alinda stepped forward, her feet gliding across the floor as if she was weightless, her eyes never leaving him. She didn't speak again, but her presence was all-consuming. Quan could feel the gravity of her gaze, the pull of the past that had always held him. The guilt, the pain, the loss, they all rushed back in a flood. Linda, he whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of his regrets. I never meant for this. I never wanted you to suffer. But Linda didn't answer him. She didn't need to. Her eyes told him everything. She had forgiven him. But forgiveness didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the pain he had caused, the things he had lost. And the truth, the terrible truth, was that the curse wasn't just about breaking free. It was about accepting the past, acknowledging it, and moving forward. Alinda's form began to fade, her figure becoming more translucent, more distant. You've broken the curse, Quan, she said, her voice soft and distant now. But there is more you must do. The room grew cold as Linda's spirit dissolved into the air, leaving Quan standing alone in the middle of the dark, silent house. The silence was deafening. Quan stood there, his heart racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The house felt emptier now, but it wasn't the emptiness of freedom. It was the emptiness of something still missing, something still left undone. The final piece of the puzzle hadn't fallen into place yet. He looked around the room, his eyes searching for something, anything, that could explain what he was feeling. The walls, once alive with the whispers of the curse, now seemed completely still. The air, once thick with dark energy, was now strangely light. The weight of the curse had lifted, but something else lingered. His mind raced, memories flooding his thoughts, his family's past, the pact that had bound him, the bloodline, Zhang, the ritual. It all seemed so distant now, so far removed from the person he had become. But there was still one thing he needed to do, one thing he hadn't faced yet. The truth was not just about breaking the curse. It was about facing the consequences of his actions, about confronting the final remnants of the darkness that had once consumed him. The house had been his prison, the river had been his torment, but now he knew the only way to truly be free was to face the last part of the curse, the part that had been passed down through the bloodline. Quan's footsteps echoed through the empty house as he made his way toward the altar, the place where it had all begun. The candle that had been lit during the ritual now sat extinguished, its wax hardened and cold. The altar, once a place of darkness, now felt empty, abandoned. He reached out, his hand brushing against the stone. And then he saw it, a symbol carved into the surface. The symbol of his family, of the bloodline that had cursed them all. It was ancient, its lines jagged and worn, as though it had been carved into the stone centuries ago. The bloodline wasn't just a curse. It was a cycle, a never-ending cycle of darkness, death, and rebirth. And now, Quan was the one who would have to break it. With a deep breath, he raised his hand to the altar, his fingers tracing the symbol. The moment his skin touched the stone, a wave of energy surged through him, a pulse of power that shook him to his core. The house seemed to breathe again, the walls groaning as if the very foundation were shifting beneath him. And then he heard it, a voice, soft but unmistakable, whispering from the shadows. You cannot break the cycle. Kwan's heart stopped.
Zhang.
Her figure appeared before him, stepping from the shadows, her eyes glowing with dark power. She smiled, a twisted, cruel smile, and for a moment, Kwan could feel the weight of her gaze bearing down on him, suffocating him. You thought you could escape, Zhang said, her voice a low, mocking whisper. You thought you could end it, but the bloodline will never be broken. It will always come back. And now, it is your turn to carry it. Her words struck like a hammer, but Kwan refused to back down. He had come too far. He had broken the curse, freed the spirits, and faced the darkness within him. But now, Zhang was the final test. She was the last piece of the puzzle. He stepped forward, his voice steady as he faced her.
No.
I won't carry this anymore. I will end it, once and for all. Zhang's smile faltered, but the darkness around her grew stronger. The house seemed to close in again, the shadows swirling like a storm. This is your bloodline, Kwan, she whispered. You are its last heir, and I am its true master. But as the darkness closed in, Kwan realized that this final test wasn't about defeating Zhang. It was about choosing to break the cycle, to end the bloodline once and for all. The choice was his. The power was his. With one final, defiant breath, Kwan reached out, his hand hovering over the symbol on the altar. And as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, he made his choice. And the cycle was broken. The house was silent again, but this time, it was the silence of something waiting to be reborn. The air hung heavy, thick with the tension of a choice yet to be made. Kwan stood at the altar, his hand still hovering over the bloodline's ancient symbol, the same symbol that had marked his family's history with death and darkness for generations. The shadows swirled around him like a living thing, pulsing with power, feeding on the fear and uncertainty that gripped his heart. Zhang's figure still loomed in the corner of the room, her smile twisted with malice. The darkness around her seemed to writhe, responding to her every movement, as though it were a reflection of her will. Her eyes gleamed with a hunger that seemed impossible to satisfy. You cannot defeat what you are, Kwan, Zhang said, her voice low and seductive. The bloodline is yours to carry. The curse is not something you can simply choose to end. It is fate. It is destiny. Kwan stood tall, his heart racing, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The words she spoke, they were the same words his ancestors had lived by. It was the same darkness that had haunted his family for centuries. But he had already defied it. He had already broken free from its hold. I'm not you, he said, his voice steady, even as the darkness pressed in on him. I'm not my ancestors. I'm not a slave to this curse. Zhang's eyes flickered with a brief flash of irritation, but her smile remained intact. You can deny it all you want, but deep down you know the truth. You are bound to it. You always have been. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse in time with her words, growing stronger, pressing against Kwan like a force he could not push away. The air felt colder, and his body shivered as if the darkness were reaching for him, trying to drag him back into its grip. But he had made his decision. This was the moment. The bloodline, the curse, it had been passed down for generations. But now it would end with him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself against the weight of the house, the darkness, and the power that had sought to control him. The mirror, the bloodline, Zhang, they had all tried to define his fate. But he was done being defined by them. He wasn't bound by the sins of his family. He wasn't the vessel for this curse. He had the power to choose. This ends tonight, he said, his voice rising, his confidence growing with each word. I am not a part of this anymore. Zhang's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. She stepped forward, her presence engulfing the room, her voice cold and sharp. You think you can just walk away from this? The blood runs in your veins, Kwan. You can't undo what is already written. But Kwan was already moving, the weight of his decision settling into his bones. He reached down, his fingers tracing the bloodline's symbol once more. And this time, instead of power, instead of darkness, he felt something else, something warm, something freeing. The bloodline had always been a chain, but now he could feel it breaking. "I choose to end it," he said softly, almost to himself. "I choose to be free." The air around him seemed to explode with energy. The shadows recoiling, the darkness shrieking in pain. Zhang's eyes widened in shock, her hand reaching out as if trying to stop him. "No!" she screamed, her voice laced with fury. "You can't do this. You're the one who will carry the curse. You are the last of the bloodline." But Quan had already stepped forward. He placed his hand over the symbol on the altar, and in that instant, everything changed. The house seemed to vibrate, the walls shaking violently as though the very foundation of the building was splitting apart. The shadows shrieked, twisting and writhing, their form collapsing in on itself, as if the very essence of darkness was being sucked away. The power of the bloodline that had gripped him for so long began to unravel, like a thread being pulled from the fabric of his existence. Zhang screamed, her form flickering, her eyes filled with rage and disbelief. You can't destroy us. You'll be nothing without it." But Quan's resolve never wavered. He had made his choice. The curse, the darkness, it had never been a part of him. It was a lie, and now he was undoing it one piece at a time. With a final, heart-wrenching crack, the house groaned, and the darkness exploded outward, dissipating into nothingness. Zhang's scream was the last thing he heard before everything went silent. Quan collapsed to his knees, the energy that had filled the room dissipating as quickly as it had come. The house fell silent. The shadows receded, their power stripped away, leaving only emptiness behind. He could feel it, the weight of the curse lifting, the burden that had been placed on him from birth vanishing like smoke in the wind. He breathed in deeply, the air around him now clear and still. For the first time in his life, he felt free. The bloodline had been broken, the curse shattered, and Zhang, the embodiment of that darkness, was gone. He had finally reclaimed his life. But as he looked around the house, the emptiness settled deep into his bones. He had destroyed the curse, but in doing so, he had also destroyed the very thing that had defined him. There was no going back to what he had known before. There was no undoing the past. The house, once filled with shadows and whispers, was now still, a hollow shell of its former self. Quan stood up, his legs unsteady but strong, his heart pounding in his chest. The decision to break the bloodline had come at a cost. He had sacrificed everything, his family, his past, his identity, to free himself from the curse. And now, there was nothing left but a future that was his to shape. The weight of the silence pressed down on him. He had been free from the darkness, but he was not free from the truth of what he had done. The curse was gone, but it had cost him everything. The guilt, the loss, the emptiness. It was a price he had been willing to pay. But he knew that the true sacrifice was not just the bloodline. It was the life he had once known. As he walked out of the house, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees, he knew that he had made the right choice. He was free, but freedom came with a price. Quan stood at the edge of Black Hollow, his feet pressing into the soft earth beneath him. The first rays of dawn filtered through the trees, bathing the land in a soft, golden light. The darkness that had once consumed the town, the house, and his very soul was gone. The curse that had followed him for as long as he could remember had been shattered, its grip broken. But even with the sun rising, even with the weight of the past lifted from his shoulders, the silence in the air was deafening. Everything felt different now. The town was still eerily so. The houses, the streets, everything was frozen in time, as if the moment of the curse's end had somehow paused the world itself. Quan's heart still raced, his pulse quickening with the realization that the journey he had started had finally come to an end. But it wasn't the end he had expected. The past, the memories of Linda, the pain, the ghosts had been left behind. The mirror was gone. The house, now a hollow shell of its former self, was no longer a place of torment. And yet, there was a haunting emptiness in the air, as if the world was waiting for him to fill the void left by everything he had sacrificed. but there was something else. A presence. For a moment, Quan stood perfectly still, his senses heightened. It wasn't a tangible feeling, not something he could touch or see, but he could feel it deep within him, as though the very ground beneath him trembled with a truth he hadn't yet understood. The darkness had been banished. Zhang was gone. The curse had been broken. And yet, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, a cold chill brushed against his skin, like a shadow that still lingered in the corners of his mind. The air smelled different, cleaner, but there was a taste of ash on his tongue, a sense that something had been left unresolved, something that couldn't be undone. He walked slowly through the empty streets, the town now as lifeless as the house he had left behind. It felt like walking through a dream where nothing seemed to belong, where the past and future coexisted in strange harmony. His footsteps echoed in the stillness, the only sound that accompanied him as he ventured deeper into the town. And then he saw it. At the center of the town, where the old chapel once stood, a new figure emerged from the mist. It was not a ghost, not a shadow, but a person. Alinda. Her form was solid, her face clear, no longer the ghostly apparition that had once haunted him. She stood before him, not the woman he had lost, not the victim of the curse, but the essence of the love and the life they had shared, reborn in a way that defied all logic. She was no longer trapped in the curse, no longer bound by the bloodline. Linda? Quan asked, his voice barely a whisper, his heart pounding in his chest. Alinda smiled softly, her eyes filled with a warmth that made the years of torment, guilt, and darkness seem to fade. She took a step toward him, her form still glowing faintly with a light that seemed to come from within. "You did it, Quan," she said, her voice clear and soothing, though it carried a weight of finality. "You broke the curse. You freed us both." The words settled on him like a blanket, the warmth of her presence washing over him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt whole. He felt at peace. "But Quan began, his voice thick with emotion, but Linda placed a finger to his lips, silencing him. "You've done more than free me, Quan. You've freed yourself," she said softly. "The bloodline was a prison for both of us, but now we can both be free." Alinda's face softened as she looked at him, her eyes filled with something Quan had almost forgotten, a deep, unspoken love that had never faded, not even in the darkest moments of his life. She was not angry. She was not bitter. She was not a ghost. She was a memory, alive again, as if the curse had been erased from her soul as much as it had from his. "I should have saved you," Quan murmured, his eyes downcast, the weight of his regret overwhelming him. "I should have done something sooner." Alinda gently cupped his chin, lifting his face so he could look into her eyes. "You couldn't have saved me, Quan."
Not then.
"Not while the curse was still alive. But you saved both of us now." She took a step back, her smile lingering, but there was something different in her gaze. It was peaceful now, knowing, and filled with a kind of finality that made Quan's heart ache. "Linda," his voice cracked as the words slipped from his lips. "I can't let you go again." But Linda shook her head, her eyes soft with understanding. "You have to. We both do. We can never go back to the way things were. The curse is gone, Quan. The past is gone. And it's time for us to let go and move forward." Her figure began to fade, the soft light around her dimming as if it were being drawn into the air itself. The world around her rippled, and Quan's breath caught in his throat as he realized what was happening. "Linda, please," he whispered, reaching out to her. But she smiled, her face calm, and whispered softly, "This is the end of the road for me, but it's only the beginning for you." As Linda disappeared into the light, her form dissolving like mist in the wind, Quan stood there, his heart heavy but no longer burdened with the weight of regret. The curse had taken everything from him, but in the end, it had given him one last gift, a chance to say goodbye. The sun had risen fully now, the warmth of its light surrounding him. The house, the town, the past, they were all gone. And with them, so too was the curse. Quan stood still for a moment, watching the place where Linda had been, feeling her presence in his heart, in his soul. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly free. The past was behind him, the curse was broken, and the weight of his family's bloodline was no longer his to bear. He turned and looked toward the horizon, the road ahead stretching out before him like an open field. The future was uncertain, but it was his to shape. The ghosts, the shadows, the darkness, they were gone. And now, he was finally free to live the life he had always dreamed of. With one final, steadying breath, he took the first step into the future. And as he walked away from the ruins of Black Hollow, he knew, whatever came next, he would face it as a man reborn. He had broken the curse, freed the spirits, and faced the darkness within him. But now, John was the final test. She was the last piece of the puzzle. He stepped forward, his voice steady as he faced her. "No, I won't carry this anymore. I will end it, once and for all." John's smile faltered, but the darkness around her grew stronger. The house seemed to close in again, the shadows swirling like a storm. "This is your bloodline, Juan," she whispered. "You are its last heir, and I am its true master." But as the darkness closed in, Juan realized that this final test wasn't about defeating John. It was about choosing to break the cycle, to end the bloodline once and for all. The choice was his. The power was his. With one final, defiant breath, Juan reached out, his hand hovering over the symbol on the altar. And as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, he made his choice, and the cycle was broken.